In the philosophy of ontology, materialism is the view that everything that exists is composed of or the result of matter, energy, and their effects. Materialism is a monist view of ontology, holding that everything is of one substance, which differs from dualism, and pluralism, which hold that reality is composed of two or more differing substances. Materialism contrasts with another monist view, idealism, which holds that the mind has metaphysical primacy over matter. In materialism, the opposite is the case. In this video, I will be arguing for materialism and clearing up some common misconceptions put forth by those who hold to a different theory of ontology. Those who use the transcendental argument for the existence of God say that, quote, the atheistic worldview cannot account for the existence of immaterial abstract ideas like logic, mathematics, reason, and other abstract concepts, unquote. They often accuse atheists of borrowing from their worldview even to do so much as talk, let alone make an argument. However, this objection is problematic. The first thing to address is that not every atheist is a materialist. Atheism is simply the lack of belief in gods. A person's atheism tells you nothing about that person's worldview, politics, morals, or belief about the origins of the human species. A lack of belief is just that. The main problem with this objection, however, is in its wording. Nothing that exists has ever been classified as immaterial. To be clear, abstract concepts like honesty and beauty are not material, but no one believes that they have their own independent existence. Nothing about materialism prohibits the formation of concepts. All that's required by this philosophy is that the apparatus for doing so be material. So how exactly does a materialist like myself account for logic, mathematics, and reason? Well, let's start with logic. Well, we can't really start there because there are many different logical systems, each possessing functionality in the paradigm in which it is applied. Usually, however, what they mean in this argument are the classical laws of logic, developed by Aristotle, so we'll deal with that. There are three laws of classical logic. The law of identity, which says if something is A, then it is A. The law of non-contradiction, which says if something is A, it cannot be not A. And the law of excluded middle, which says something is either A or not A. One could argue that there is only the law of identity and the other two are mere corollaries, but that's a mere quibble. These laws are rigorously tested axioms that are derived from our perception of the world as logically behaving. Let me explain. Our day-to-day perception of virtually everything in the universe is as a discrete entity. Every entity is always what it is and is not that which it is not. Rigorous testing by repeated observations allows for us to conceptualize an entirely analytic system of thought with specific rules. Mathematics works the same way. We humans have the ability to subitize, meaning that we can detect the number of objects present in a set just at first glance. This ability typically stops when the number of objects exceeds 7. From simple yet rigorous axioms, we can build whole analytic systems of thought and apply those principles in successfully understanding the world around us. This is called reasoning. Although language is a different type of abstraction, the rules of language systems also have their basis in the laws of logic. We assign to objects, processes, and descriptions of our experience specific units of meaning, and this takes various forms. Utterances with our vocal cords.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious, and don't call me Shirley.
Movements with our hands. Pictures on walls. And writing on various media. We convey ideas and communicate through language, meaning that we mean what we mean and don't mean that which we do not mean. Nothing about materialism forbids this as the basis for all these abstractions and their application, just as long as they occur in a physical system, in this case the brain. A mind is only needed for the concept, not the reality to which the concept refers. The next objection is one that I call the informational objection. This is put forth by creationists and many other theists that information cannot arise from matter. Information is necessarily the product of a mind. We'll address this claim as used by creationists and then address the other areas in which this claim typically shows up. Creationists often point to DNA, as information and therefore evidence of design. They typically petition molecular biologists and other scientists to explain how it could have come about by chance or emerged without a mind behind it. Well, the very premise of this objection is false. DNA is not information. DNA is just a molecule that consists of chemical nucleotide sequences with the ability to copy themselves. The role of DNA in genetics and life in general is not so much informational as biochemical. The structure of DNA determines its role in living organisms. Information is just a model that we cast onto the phenomenon of DNA in order to make sense of it. DNA only operates according to the rules of biochemistry and physics. There is no end goal for DNA. The other objection is that we cannot be strictly material because of the existence of information in general. Christian apologist and mathematician John Lennox says that there must be something more to us than matter, in the same way that there is something more to the contents of a book than the ink on the page. This objection fails because Lennox and many others like him who raise this objection fails to realize that information is not intrinsic in matter, but rather an idea cast upon matter by us. As you are listening to my voice, the primary auditory cortex in the temporal lobe of your brain is processing the mechanical oscillations going into your ear from the audio device you're using to listen to this videos. These waves are processed as sounds specifically corresponding to utterances made in the English language in such a way that you understand what I'm saying to you as I say it. However, the mechanical waves by which I convey the words I speak have no intrinsic meaning prior to their being understood by a hearer. They don't even exist as sound prior to their being understood by a hearer. Information does require a mind, but it's a communication between two minds that have the ability to understand it. Without those minds, there is no information, just raw phenomena. The third and final objection, and there are probably more out there, will be the one on which I spend the most time. It is the objection put forth by idealists like Johann Roth, specifically in one of his videos that I'll address sooner, and Inspiring Philosophy in one of his videos and in the lengthy exchange of comments he and I had. I will deal with IP's objections and then move on to Roth's. The first objection, for those who can't see it, it says, which is, there is no theory of emergence which can explain how physical processes can produce mental substances. You need a coherent theory of how they can emerge. Just assuming mental events must come from physical processes is not an argument for how it's possible. By the way, I responded to all of these objections in the comment section of his introspective argument, but for the purposes of this video, I am choosing to refine them so I can better explain what I mean. First of all, I don't like your phrasing. When you talk about mental substances, you're attempting to categorize things like the color red and the taste of sugar as actual things unto themselves. For the purposes of this video, I will call what IP calls mental substances internal outputs. That is, they are internal as they occur in the mind, but they are outputs as they are the way in which externally existing objective phenomena are then processed by the brain. Among neuroscientists, IP and DRESD 83 not included, the consensus is that the internal outputs or perceptions are the result of distal objects simulating the sensory organs, and that stimulation is converted into a neural signal. This is called transduction. The process of transduction creates a proximal stimulus, a pattern of neural activity that is processed in the brain. There is actually a field of study called psychophysics that tries to explain this very phenomena. This is not an assumption. This is something that we can observe and objectively verify.
Because we rely on our eyes for most of our sensory input, we often forget just how important the sense of touch can be. The touch receptors in our skin can provide information about things like pressure, heat, cold, and pain. Touch receptors collect information and fire it along nerves up to the sensory cortex of the brain. Scientists have been able to map which areas of the brain receive information from the body. Because our touch receptors are concentrated in some areas more than others, different amounts of the brain are devoted to our body's sense of touch. We'd look very different if you made a model of our body in proportion to the amount of brain power dedicated to the touch receptors. We'd have enormous lips, tongue, and fingertips, because these are some of the most touch-sensitive parts of the body.
One must understand that there is nothing special about internal outputs. It could have been the case, had we evolved differently, that electromagnetic wavelengths produced a specific smell, sound, or some other sensation. After all, this is the case for people who have synesthesia. The only reason this big gap seems unbridgeable is because IP is subtly shifting perspectives from third person to first person as he does here.
The hard problem of consciousness is not addressed by evolution, as it fails to explain how things like qualia can form from purely physical processes. Physical processes have only been observed to produce more of the physical, not different substances altogether. Thus, consciousness infers the existence of mental, non-physical substances.
Let's look at his next objection.
Given the problems that result from being simulated on a computer, one can find a much simpler explanation that the universe is being simulated in a mind. This would solve many problems of being simulated on a computer, because a mind has elements of integrated information states and also processes information, and the physics in a dream environment would emerge from information processing and therefore look identical to the conditions of our world as we described earlier. So a dream environment just emerges from platonic information in a mind, which is essentially the same type of physics we see in a generic information construct, such as the illusion of space and matter and the elements which make it finite and computable.
Wrong, still taking things out of context to support your argument. I said a dream environment just emerges from platonic information in a mind, which is essentially the same type of physics we see in a generic information construct. So a dream would emerge analogously like a simulation would. Not that the mind emerges from something physical or that the mind is a computer. This is very dishonest of you. The mind is a substance from which a dream, or qualia, physical experience of reality emerges. I did not say the mind is exactly analogous to the way a computer behaves, or that the mind is emergent. Well, if IP is simply going to assert that the mind is a substance unto itself, he needs to provide evidence for that conclusion rather than simply assert it. Here is the next objection. First, the mind is not a physical substance because it doesn't have physical properties. It isn't bound to physical descriptions or moves spatially. The properties of the mind are not that which matter can have. Beliefs, mental substances, are either true or false. Matter cannot have this. Matter can be spatial, but mental priorities are not. Nothing about the mind and matter says they are the same, so they are fundamentally different. Second, because of this, emergence is really the unsupported assertion, which you never backed up in your video. You just assumed it was true, which question begging. Sounds like shitty grammar. Do you speak English?
But are chemical reactions true or false?
The main difficulty with these objections is that IP, unlike most philosophers, has trouble defining his terms. Treating the mind as something unto itself is grossly misleading, especially in the face of all the neuroscientific evidence which shows that the mind is an emergent property of the brain. A point on which I barely touched in the last video on quantum physics and materialism was the issue of perceptual thresholds. The fact that there are phenomena that we cannot perceive in principle. There are wavelengths of light and electromagnetic radiation invisible to us, but visible to butterflies and bees. The pit viper's sense of thermoception is not in its nerve endings, as is the case for us humans, but in its eyes. Dolphins can echolocate using high-frequency clicks and chirps that are inaudible to our ears. If only our mind and its perceptions are fundamental, what are these animals acting on and responding to in order to navigate their environment? Seriously, if you want us to take your quantum physics seriously, why not take modern zoology seriously?